Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Social Problems. Hopefully you've had some time to go through the course website. I do want to just kind of point out a couple of things that may be useful for you. Well, and that you will need to use, I should say. Over here on the sidebar, as you see, are the Packback questions. And so this will take you to Packback. It'll look a little bit different for you than me. So I've posted one question here, just kind of generally to show you how it works. You'll be given a curiosity score that is calculated by some complex algorithms used by the AI. We will, myself and the TAs, look over, each post, not completely give power over to the robots. And so what you'll do is each class period, you'll watch the lecture and then ask a question like this, and then you'll respond. And so you can see here that a number of students have responded. And so that's basically what you'll do. You'll make one question and then two responses for each class period. And we're basically giving you till about 3 o'clock each class period day to do that. So once we get going with this, I know it's kind of confusing. You've got 3 different digital platforms just for this class. But this becomes a great way in which we can discuss these social problems and so on. The other thing that I did want to point out too is Cengage. So you will have you'll be logging into Cengage. The instructions are on the syllabus, but basically kind of showing you what it is that you're going to be looking at. Got a cat competing for my attention right now. So basically what you will do, you'll see the course here. I don't know if you can hear my cat. Okay. So let me move this out of the way. Willow, it's okay. I'll be able to play with you in a little bit. Okay, so you can see here the Cengage stuff, and for each one you've got a different assignment. And so what you'll be doing are these explore assignments. You see these practice tests here, but those are just basically, for your own good. You're not being graded on those, but you will be graded on these explore assignments. So anyway, I just wanted to go over that stuff again. Okay, now getting more back into our course. I want to go over the lecture for today, and I kind of, as I said, it's kind of a idiosyncratic course because I start out by talking a little bit about not just social problems, but also different philosophies. So one of the important things to understand about any social sciences is that we're building up theories. We're using a lot of evidence to develop a set of assumptions, propositions, kind of explanations in terms of what's going on in the world or whatever process we're looking at. We develop a theory, and then we spend a lot of time testing those theories, retesting them, improving them or discounting them completely. So there are a couple of different types of reality that we can talk about. One is objective reality. So the objective reality of the fact that humans have, morals and ideas about what is right and wrong, that sort of thing. So that's objective. We know that humans have morals and so on. Subjective reality is basically how we come to define something as a problem. If you remember from that little comedic video, David Mitchell, the comedian, talks about how, we all have different ideas about what's going on, what's going wrong with the world. So in your book, you'll be asked to look at these different perspectives in sociology. One is called the functionalist perspective. So basically, the functionalist perspective looks at society kind of like a human body, where you have the different organs, which are basically different social institutions, like educational systems, religions, the family, all of these different things, that work together to make society function. I've got this, I don't know what she is. She's an institution in our family, kind of the ruling institution of our family. Got to give her some attention, or else she'll be annoying me for the rest of the lecture. She only has one eye, but that does not slow her down at all. Okay, so another perspective that sociologists often use is what's called the conflict perspective. This considers basically, hold her like a baby. All right, enough attention for now. I've got to teach a class. They're not paying thousands of dollars to see this adorable cat. All right. Okay, so the conflict perspective looks at power differences in society. So it can look at power differences in terms of wealth, political power, gender, race, all of these different things. And then finally, the last perspective that we're going to spend some time on, in some ways is similar to social psychology. It focuses on how we construct our social reality, different words and symbols that we use. It emphasizes what we call human agency, which is this ability, essentially the ability to exercise free will. At the same time, interactionists recognize that our society is organized and patterned according to certain interactions. And we've, COVID, I think we got used to society being organized in a certain way, and then COVID came along and we've had to sort of readjust some of these different things. Okay, so those are the main sociological perspectives that you'll see in the book and in the mind tap exercises. Now we move into moral philosophy, and the rest of this stuff is not in the textbook. So one of the key things that's kind of interesting, for some reason it's sort of a divide, what we're really looking at is how do we achieve social justice and liberty? Social justice meaning general justice in terms of fairness in society and so on. Liberty being the state of freedom, free from oppressive institutions and so on and so forth. Now, oftentimes what you see is people on the political right or libertarians focus primarily on liberty, and then you have people on the political left, progressives, liberals, and so on, focus on social justice. And then you have someone like me who tries to be a wide-ranging thinker who says maybe we can work on both at the same time. At the end of the day, justice is liberty. Social justice recognizes, though, that it's not just individuals who have their liberty trampled on or held down and so on, but rather you have social groups that are held down by other groups in society and so on and so forth. So I don't see why there's this silly divide between the two, and I think actually they complement each other quite well. So we are living in quite an interesting time. There's no perfect, bunch of images that can capture everything we see going on in 2021. The one thing that I do want to, point out is that we don't know. One thing we do know for sure is that coronavirus is going to still be around and is still going to be reshaping the world. We know that the new president has come into the United States, and that's going to maybe change relations with other countries. We'll talk about that later. We also know that there is a domestic terror threat in the United States, and we'll talk about that in great detail later. These are pictures from the protest. What was it now? 3 weeks ago. We had one Wednesday where there was an insurrection. The next Wednesday was an impeachment, and the following Wednesday was an inauguration. So quite an interesting 3 weeks in American history. And as the Capitol was stormed, you saw these dramatic pictures of, the guards blocking the entrance to the Senate with their guns drawn. China is rising, and you can't really talk about the world without talking about China. And so we'll be talking about things going on in China quite a bit, as they relate to social problems in the United States and more globally. Now, I briefly on Packbag just kind of asked a question: what do you think is the biggest problem in society today? I asked something similar in my intro to sociology class. A lot of people said, one of the biggest problems are the divisions in our society. And a lot of those divisions are based upon different ideas in terms of what people think are social problems. If you're really interested in this stuff, I would highly recommend these two books, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Joshua Green, Moral Tribes, and I'll talk about that one later on in the class. But these are two very good books about how psychologically we do group people into different categories, and sort of how we manage that, I think, is going to be very important for how we manage our societies this century. I talked about theory already. So one of the things that I often do is start the class by doing the classic trolley problem, which some of you are probably familiar with. Basically, you're this person here. You come walking across this trolley, and for whatever reason, the brakes have gone out and it's going to kill these 5 people. You have the chance to pull the lever and it will change the track, but you'll end up killing the one person. So when I, ask this question in a poll, usually you get around 95% or so that will pull the lever to change the track, killing the one person but saving the 5. Kind of, very, very few people decide not to do anything. So oftentimes, as I said, what a lot of people do is pull the lever. So you get about 95% of people doing that to save the 5 people's lives at the expense of the one person's life. Now, there's another sort of, there's been various additions to this. One of the first is similar scenario. You've got the trolley flying down the track and you're on this bridge and there's this large man there and you can push the man over and evidently he will, he'll get killed. The trolley will hit him, but it will be derailed and will save the 5 people. So the end outcome is the same. You have one person dead, but you've saved 5 people. But when you ask that, or when I ask that, you get a much lower percentage of people who would be willing to push this person over. I forget, it's really low. Sometimes like 50, 60% fewer people would be willing to do that. And then we get into a debate about, okay, well, why is that? How is it that before you're willing to have one person die to save the 5, but in this you're not? And people will say, well, something about the physical act of pushing. And that's actually very true. That's backed up by some neuroscience. But morally, it's really no different. In the one, you're pressing a lever. The other, you're physically pushing. Sometimes I'll ask, well, what if you had a lever and you could open it up and drop the person down there? There's other versions too, where, what if the one person here is, your significant other, your best friend, that sort of thing. You can look at all different ways of doing this. Now, I've had students say, I hate the trolley experiment because it's not very realistic. I'll get to that in a moment, how it has become realistic. So one of the key things is this represents utilitarian thinking. So utilitarians seek to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Jeremy Bentham was kind of the key thinkers in this area. Interestingly, we believe he probably had Asperger's. Utilitarianism was made famous by one of the Star Trek movies. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one classic utilitarian logic there. Now, as I said, I've had students say, well, this trolley experiment, you don't come across that situation in real life, so it's really not very useful. But that was before people started thinking about automatic cars. So now I have this in the modules. You can do this on your own. It's not required or anything. But MIT has this Moral Machine website, because what they're trying to do is figure out how self-driving cars are going to make decisions. So you've got this self-driving car, say that you're in, all these people are here. You could turn, but you would kill this one person, but save all these people. In this one, you would hit the wall, but you'd save the person, but you may end up hurting yourself. Whoops. And then this final one, there's a group of people, you can hit the wall and so on. So this is a very practical application. The technology behind, driving cars is pretty good. I mean, it's, there's still lots and lots of problems, but it's advancing quite rapidly. The morality, though, is quite different. You can imagine models in the future like, the Toyota utilitarian that will, save the many for the few in case you get in a wreck or something like that. Or a more libertarian vehicle that, will just plow on through or something and save you. Which brings us to libertarianism. So libertarianism basically argues that it is unjust for governments or centralized organizations and so on to impose rules upon people. So libertarianism seeks to maximize autonomy, freedom of choice. Sometimes people argue that it's all about markets, not necessarily capitalism. But the main idea is centered around the idea of liberty, of individualism, and so on. Some of the key thinkers in this area: Friedrich Hayek, Robert Nozick, who I'll talk about, Murray Rothbard, and others. One of the classic texts of of libertarianism is Anarchy, State, and Utopia by Robert Nozick, although there's a number of books you will probably want to read before you try and tackle that one. So Nozick, basically, he makes these two conditions for libertarianism. One, there must be justice in acquisition, meaning your initial holdings, you got it, what you have, you got your phone based upon the work that you've done, and you didn't steal it or something like that. Justice and transfer, kind of similar. You pay for things, you get things through the market as opposed to just stealing and so on. Now, Nozick made a very radical argument where he said that taxation of earnings from labor is on a par with forced labor. Seizing the results of someone's labor is equivalent to seizing hours from him and directing him to carry on various activities. So he's basically making this radical argument that, okay, taxation equals forced taking of earnings. So say you're working in an hourly paid job. Basically, the last 2 hours of the day, that money is essentially being taken from you to pay taxes. So he says that the takings of earnings equals forced labor. So you're basically working, but you're not directly receiving the benefits. And he says that forced labor equals slavery. Now, as I said, that's a very, very radical argument. Over time, Nozick sort of backed away from that. These days, you don't see libertarians arguing that quite as often, that, taxation equals slavery. That's been roundly criticized. But what they will say is that taxation equals theft. And I think that's a stronger philosophical and economic foundation. When you say that taxation equals slavery, well, it's not quite the same. People can choose different jobs where they're taxed at different rates, things like that. Slavery, by its definition, you just don't have any choice. So as I said, Nozick kind of backed away from that argument. So what do we do then? And how do libertarians see this world where you've got this growing middle class that's collapsing into a working class and into a growing underclass? At the same time, we have more wealth being created than ever before. I forget the number of billionaires that have been made just over the last few months because of the pandemic, but it's a huge jump in terms of certain companies, going into demand. Libertarians will argue, a couple of famous libertarians, Charles and David Koch. David Koch died last year, I believe. Their argument is that instead of having government pay for certain services, that it should come from charitable donations. So the Koch brothers, famous libertarians, they also donate a lot of money to these various, institutions such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the American Museum of Natural History, and so on and so forth. One of the key thinkers, another key thinker of libertarianism is Friedrich Hayek. Hayek comes about, his famous book, The Constitution of Liberty. He basically lives through the First World War and the Second World War, and like many people is worried about the rise of fascism. He's seeing totalitarianism in the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth, and he's very worried about this happening to Western European countries, to the United States, and so on. And he writes this book called The Road to Serfdom, and there's like a comic version where he makes this argument that essentially when you have government being involved in society, the economy, that it will inevitably become totalitarian, become like the Nazi government, fascist regimes, and so on. So for Hayek, he had this interesting argument about freedom and liberty. He basically said that freedom really depends on property rights. So really at the heart of Hayek and a lot of libertarianism is this idea that freedom is tied to property. Not everyone agrees with this, but that's kind of a major argument in the libertarian tradition. And then the sort of second argument is that a lot of regulation or redistribution through taxation leads to serfdom. Serfdom being like the peasants of medieval times. Okay. So one thing, a couple other things, Hayek believed that markets are, he called them naturally constructed. He says that they represent a spontaneous order. People have criticized that for saying, well, isn't any sort of organization made spontaneous order? You could say that any government develops spontaneously, and so on and so forth. I think he was referring to the idea that decisions can often happen more quickly in markets. Again, this is something he's been criticized for. And he also argues that individual and social behavior are more motivated by self-interest and profit more than anything else. And these are things you can debate, unpack back, and we can talk about as we move along. So Hayek did see a role for government, though, to protect private property, contracts, freedom of speech, that sort of thing. He says democracy is okay unless it threatens property rights. People can vote in a tyrant. People can vote in a dictator. So democracy by itself is not necessarily, doesn't necessarily guarantee freedom. So again, a couple key texts of libertarianism, Hayek's Constitution of Liberty and Nozick's Anarchy in State and Utopia. So some of the objections to, I'll go down here. Okay, some of the objections to the libertarian views, one is, at least on taxation, one is that the poor actually need the money. Whereas we don't find that wealthy people often spend as much. Taxation by the consent of the governed is fine as long as it's democratic, and so on. And another argument is that the successful owe a debt to society. That, that basically it's the infrastructure, all that government spending that, helped create the internet through military spending and so on. The interstate system was actually created as a way in which to move military vehicles quickly across the country, and so on. So, something you can think about: are you more of a utilitarian? Are you more of a libertarian? Something you can consider. Other things, feel free to ask these on Packback, or engage them in different ways. Just, do you agree with libertarians on taxation? And maybe beyond that, should taxing the wealthy be used for public services, helping the poor, research, military, and so on and so forth? Okay, now another kind of key thinker in the sort of the Western tradition, it was a guy named John Rawls. And actually, you'll probably need to read John Rawls before you would read Robert Nozick. I kind of chronologically did it backwards. But Rawls is a famous political theorist. He wrote this book called The Theory of Justice. So he basically says that, yes, you want a free market economy, whether it's capitalist or socialist, having certain socialist aspects to it. He says you don't want a command economy like you had in the former Soviet Union or China before they started, liberalizing their economy, and so on. So he kind of asks us to think about I'll ask us to think about the inequalities in our society. So you have Michael Phelps, a swimmer who has, I believe, still holds the records for most Olympic medals ever won, net worth $55 million. Michael Jordan, phenomenal basketball player. 1999, he was named the North American Athlete of the 20th Century because he played a few different sports. Net worth $1.6 billion. So the question then is, do they deserve this money? And I'm not making any value judgment. I'm asking you. You can discuss this on Packback or just think about it in your mind. Another thing to think about: how much does the Penn State football coach make? I believe last I heard he makes about $6 million a year, I think, something like that. So, just a little bit less than I do. I think he's doing okay, though. Okay, so one of the things that I'll return to this in a moment. So, think about these very wealthy people, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, Bill Gates, and so on and so forth. So Rawls, he starts from this point of what's called moral arbitrariness, meaning that basically where we end up in society is a result of a couple of different things: our nature, our biological predispositions, plus the social conditions, where we grow up, the level of income in our household, the neighborhood, that sort of thing. that basically means no moral desert. So what do I mean by desert, and why am I spelling it wrong here? I'm not meaning dessert like this wonderful dessert that's making me hungry right now. Desert meaning deserving, essentially. That when we look at the totality of things that influence us and make us who we are, when I look at myself as a professor of Penn State, I can sit back and think, wow, it's just because I'm so brilliant and I'm such a genius and all of that. But then I also think about the fact that, well, I've also got a lot of professors and scientists in my family, kind of grew up in a sort of intellectual atmosphere and so on. Maybe that had something to do with, my relative success in life and so on. He doesn't mean, you shouldn't take any responsibility for your actions, but recognize it's not just your free will that gets you where you want to be. So he has this very interesting thought experiment. So he wants us to start from this hypothetical situation. So say you are able to create a new society to live in. You say you're orbiting the planet Earth and you can make a new society down there. There's one catch, and you would be living in this society. But there's one catch, though. No one knows his place in society or their class position or social status, nor does anyone know their fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, their intelligence, strength, and the like. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. That's kind of a key term there. So you don't know, you could be thrown into this world and say you wanted the world to exist like it is now. You could be thrown into the world with some horrible health problem, disability, or an oppressed minority in some country, so on and so forth. So, the veil of ignorance, this idea that no one knows where you would end up. So basically he's saying, okay, so design a society where you would want to end up. So he acknowledges from the libertarians that, yes, most people are self-interested, and there's, very biological reasons for that. So he says that, when people act in their own self-interest, what they would probably want is to be thrown into a society where there's relative equality of liberty, where you're able to, speak your mind or practice the religion you want or whatever it might be, listen to the music you want, drive if you want, that sort of thing. So he says that out of people's own self-interest, they would want a system of relative equality of liberty. They would also want a relative equality of opportunity, meaning that, relatively good hospitals, an equal distribution of good hospitals. Make it so that, if not everybody guaranteed a job like in a communist system, that there's a relative equality of opportunity nonetheless. And I really like this quote by him that kind of gets at some of these things. He says the natural distribution is neither just nor unjust, nor is it unjust that persons are born into society at some particular position. These are simply natural facts. What is just and unjust is the way that institutions deal with these facts. So some of us are born with health issues and so on and so forth. There's nothing, unjust about that. So, for example, I have asthma. There's nothing unjust about me having asthma. That's just sort of the natural, the natural condition. Now, it's up to society then to make sure that we have a healthcare system so that asthmatics like me can use medicine that will help me be able to teach classes and things like that. So again, it's the society, it's the institutions that are just or unjust. So he kind of gets us to kind of think about it in terms of a game of chance versus a game of skill. So if you win the lottery, no one's going to argue that, you are not, entitled to those winnings. You got the right set of numbers. You got lucky. but it's not the same as, Michael Phelps or someone winning, an Olympic sport or any sort of game where they deserve to win. It's different there. The game of skill is a game where you deserve to win. So how do we get out of this conundrum? I don't think actually this is so out of date. Since I made this this slide, Bill Gates is no longer the richest person in the world. It was Jeff Bezos. And I think just last week, Elon Musk, the inventor, became, I believe he became the richest person in the world now. Anyway, okay, so we talked about Michael Jordan, Michael Phelps, and here we got Bill Gates. So in a capitalist world, how can we have any sort of, egalitarianism or something like this? So Rawls develops what he calls the difference principle. People can gain from their natural talents and social conditions, but it is only morally justified if it helps those who weren't awarded with such good chances at the lottery of life. Now, Michael Jordan, it wasn't just that he was a, phenomenal basketball player. He had great coaches. He had mentors throughout his life. Same thing with Michael Phelps. If you look, I've studied entrepreneurship. If you look at entrepreneurs, they're often, helped out by other mentors and so on and so forth. So Rawls says that, you can have a capitalist system that's unequal, but if people like Michael Jordan are developing, say, a foundation to help, underprivileged youth, or Bill Gates is paying more in taxes or something like this, and that money's going to, help create better schools or whatever, then, Rawls's difference principle is met. So he says that basically two principles of justice would emerge. You would have equal basic liberty for all citizens. That would be libertarian over utilitarian. And it permits only those whose inequalities, it will allow inequalities as long as they work to the advantage of society. So another thing you might want to discuss, feel free to ask this question or go into greater detail. In Packback, do you agree with this? Would you design that sort of world if you were, thrown behind the veil of ignorance? So I'm gonna, I think I'll end it there, and I'll kind of finish up with communitarianism. Oops. Yes. I'll finish with communitarianism on Monday, and then we'll sort of move along. So today, usually lectures will go 30 to 35 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, but it should give you enough time, the 10-15 minutes, to make a post, and you're actually allowed to post a little bit past the class period. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope it lends to some good discussion on Packback. Have a good first weekend, everyone.